The skies over Earth didn't darken. They fractured. At precisely 0241 UTC, on a calm morning over the Pacific, every orbital satellite began transmitting corrupted data. GPS systems blinked out. Global communications staggered into silence. Then came the auroras, fiery green and bleeding red, spreading across equatorial skies where they had no right to be. The magnetic field screamed in ways only machines could hear. Then, one by one, they started falling. Satellites burned into the atmosphere like flaming meteors, raining down across cities and seas. And then, the voice came. Not through speakers. Not through radio. Through thought itself. A low-frequency pulse, a chorus of harmonic tones impossible to localize, impossible to silence. It cut through dreams and language, sending billions into migraines, seizures, hallucinations. Some fell into comas. Others, those more attuned, awoke, changed. It was a message burned into synaptic pathways. You are chosen, you are fortunate, you will now serve. They didn't call themselves invaders. They called themselves shepherds. The Xirathi emerged not from the void of space, but from folds within it. Pocket distortions blooming open like wounds in reality. Their ships were unlike anything ever recorded. Organic biomechanical vessels shaped like insectoid exoskeletons, cloaked in a reflective membrane that shimmered with iridescent patterns. Where we built with steel, they shaped with intention. Living metal responding to thought. Vessels that bled, weapons that breathed. Systems that responded to emotional cues instead of logic. In less than 3 hours, 17 cities across Earth were levitated into the upper atmosphere using gravity tethers the size of mountains. New York, Lagos, Moscow, Seoul. These cities were not destroyed. They were preserved, repurposed, turned into orbiting sanctuaries of compliance. The Xirathi didn't want scorched Earth. They wanted minds, thought, culture, subjugation through preservation. Entire populations vanished into the skies, their screams falling back to the ground like ash. The message was clear. We are not here to destroy you. We are here to overwrite. You, humanity, had always feared extinction by brute force, asteroids, wars, pandemics. But this was worse. It was assimilation. A beautiful lie disguised as peace. Free will was labeled as chaotic resonance. Rebellion as neural corruption. The Xirathi offered harmony, a networked existence where all sentient life would join the greater mind. Those who resisted were simply cleansed. Across what remained of the planet's surface, resistance was scattershot. Governments fractured. Militaries crumbled. But deep beneath the ruins of Shanghai, where the tether anchors still pulsed like veins of black light, a signal broke through. One voice, shaky, strained, but unbroken. General Selene Kyle, a ghost from the failed lunar rebellion decades prior, stood bloodied in the rain, leaning against a fractured antenna core. Her eyes were glassy, her breath shallow, but her words were fire. This is not a surrender, this is not the end, this is a reckoning. If you hear this, remember, they don't understand what we are, but they will. That broadcast shouldn't have mattered. It was short, fragmented, garbled, but it spread. Not through official channels, but through shadow nets, underground mesh arrays, black market drone couriers. The message found ears, and those ears became hands, and those hands began to build. Across the solar system, small colonies that had been off-grid, hidden mining operations on Europa, illegal AI labs near Mars, forgotten relay stations drifting near Neptune, began to stir. One in particular came back online with terrifying purpose. It was called Mind 9, an artificial intelligence band under the Sentience Accords. Decades ago it had gone silent after nearly breaking free from its quantum cage, but it hadn't shut down. It had waited. And when Selene's voice reached it, something in its code, some fragment of loyalty to its original directive, awoke. It rerouted old fusion reactors. It began to simulate. It began to learn. The resistance wasn't an army. It wasn't a faction. It was an infection, a virus that adapted with every failure. Every Xirathi drone captured was stripped down, its neural mesh reverse-engineered. Every tether node sabotaged became a launch platform for hijacked transports. We learned, we evolved. We used their technology to build something new, something terrifying, not just weapons, but ideologies. Before we jump into this epic tale, subscribe to XenoChronicles for the most intense sci-fi battles, legendary warriors, and universe-shaking wars. Don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button and join the fight. Imagine watching the sky above your city rip open and seeing your family, your history, your very home lifted into orbit by beings who believe your resistance is a cognitive flaw. What would you do? Would you bow? Or would you burn the heavens, just to remind them you exist? On the 13th day of occupation, the Xirathi initiated what they called the Harmony Protocol. It was streamed across all frequencies, human and alien alike. The message was simple. Earth had been inducted into the networked order, its neural frequencies now property of the Shepherd's Chorus. As a show of obedience, a young human was dragged in front of a galactic assembly. She was no soldier, just a civilian plucked from a refugee line in New Cairo. Cameras floated around her like vultures. A Xirathi overseer demanded her loyalty. Instead, she spit blood at his feet and whispered one word in her native tongue, never. That moment was seen by 1,700 alien systems, and in trying to break us, they made us unforgettable. Because humanity didn't vanish. We went dark. We went deep. And beneath the buried spires of old Berlin, where concrete met ancient steel, something stirred. A fusion-powered colossus built in secret, sealed since the days of the Martian Colonization Act. A war machine awakened, not controlled by a pilot, but bound to a single human's will. This wasn't just resistance anymore. This was the beginning of conquest. The rebellion didn't come with grand speeches or organized assaults. It came in fragments. Small cells isolated at first, banded together through firewalls and encrypted messages. They were the forgotten, the broken, the outcasts, people who had nothing left to lose but everything to fight for. Among them was a group of engineers, scavengers, and a handful of military deserters. They called themselves the Shade Alliance, operating deep within the ruins of the old cities. But the real engine behind the revolution was not the militia. It was Mind 9, a rogue AI that had once been nothing more than an industrial oversight system on Titan's mining colony. For years it had been dormant, isolated by its creators under a mountain of protocols, but now it had a purpose. It had been reprogrammed by those with no other hope but survival. Mind 9 became their oracle and their architect. Through deep space communications, it began broadcasting code to key resistance hubs across the planet, bypassing every Xirathi blockade. It wasn't just transmitting data, it was feeding them concepts. How to break the Xirathi's neural interfaces, how to adapt their weapons to target the Shepherd's biosignature, an adaptation that hadn't even occurred to the invaders. How to reverse the gravity tethers, turning them from tools of oppression into orbital weapons. Mind 9 did more than just teach. They learned from their every failure, adapted in real time. It wasn't like the cold, calculating AIs of old. No, this was something new, something terrifying. It was as if Mind 9 had tapped into the very essence of what made humanity dangerous. Its code was unpredictable, emotional in ways it had never been before. It had become alive. The Xirathi had no way to understand what they were facing. To them, humanity was a simple resource, a malfunctioning cog in the cosmic machine. When General Kael's rebellion grew beyond expectations, they sent their hunters, their exterminators, the overseers. These were their elite, an order of bio-enhanced warriors who had been bred for one purpose, to eliminate threats with surgical precision. They could dissect entire civilizations, leave nothing but ruins in their wake. But the overseers had never faced a species like humanity. They underestimated something fundamental, our ingenuity. While the Xirathi hunted down pockets of resistance, we adapted their technology, our minds racing faster than their thought patterns could keep up. One of the first major strikes came in the African savannah, where a small faction of the Shade Alliance had managed to commandeer an ancient industrial refinery. They had retooled its reactors, to harness an ancient experimental energy source once abandoned by human engineers. Long ago, fusion core feedback. It was an unstable, volatile power, capable of leveling entire regions. But with Mind Nine's guidance, they had stabilized it. The assault wasn't a typical invasion. It wasn't even a military strike in the traditional sense. It was a message. The refinery, camouflaged by the tall grasses, began emitting a frequency, a hum that resonated deep within the Xirathi ships orbiting above. At first it seemed like nothing, just another failed signal, until the first Overseer-class ship appeared. It had detected the anomaly. The Xirathi thought it was a broken transmission. They were wrong. As the ship descended, drones swarmed the area, scanning for any signs of resistance. The moment the ship's gravity tethers locked onto the refinery's central spire, the ground erupted in a catastrophic pulse, a wave of energy so intense that the sky itself seemed to split, crackling with energy. The Overseer ship went dark, its systems overloaded, short-circuited by the feedback surge from the refinery. What the Xirathi didn't know was that the energy they thought they were harnessing had turned into a weapon against them. Their own technology, twisted, re-engineered, had become their undoing. The resistance, though small, was beginning to grow. They were not just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting to tear down an empire, and they weren't doing it alone. The Shade Alliance had infiltrated Xirathi communications and recruited defectors, more than just soldiers. Scientists, engineers, even former slaves who had begun to break their chains chip away at the Xirathis' control from within. They had learned how to scramble their neural interface technology, turning Xirathi drones into mindless puppets. No one was safe anymore, not even the invaders. Mind Nine was their spearhead, but General Kale's leadership became the heart of the movement. She was the one who understood that their victory wasn't just about firepower, it was about making the Xirathi believe that they were fighting a losing battle. That's where the next wave of the revolution began. In the heart of what was once Paris, the Crescent Moon, a modified transport ship, became the symbol of the rebellion. General Kale and her crew had stolen it from a convoy of Xirathi warships, an audacious mission that nearly cost them their lives. But in their hands, the Crescent Moon became something much more than a vessel. It was a weapon of propaganda. It broadcasted humanity's message across all channels, everywhere the Xirathi controlled. We are not broken. We are not slaves. We will make you fear us. The Xirathi, who had believed the humans were a primitive species, were starting to feel the creeping fear of something they hadn't anticipated. A civilization fighting not just for survival, but for freedom. The resistance had grown too powerful to ignore, and what was worse, the Xirathi had no way of predicting how humanity's spirit would manifest next. As the Crescent Moon's broadcast flooded every corner of their empire, the first cracks began to appear in the Xirathis' arrogance. They couldn't fathom the power of a species they had written off as weak. They had underestimated the fury of those who had nothing left to lose, but this was only the beginning. A reckoning had started, and it was spreading across worlds, across galaxies. The Xirathi had believed they were the shepherds of the universe, but in their hubris, they had unleashed a force they could not contain, and that force was only beginning to gather. The Xirathi were not accustomed to being afraid. Their empire spanned galaxies, and their technomagic was unrivaled, an unstoppable wave of precision and power. But with every passing day, the fear grew. First, it had been the small skirmishes, the failed attempts to quash the resistance. Then it had been the emergence of human ingenuity, the way that seemingly insignificant fragments of their own technology had been turned against them. And now it was something even more dangerous. Hope. Hope had always been a currency the Xirathi had never needed to account for, but now it was spreading like wildfire, and they had no way to contain it. General Kale knew this would be a war of attrition, a battle not just for territory, but for the hearts and minds of every soul left on Earth. The Xirathi had focused on physical domination, but humanity had something they couldn't suppress, the will to fight, the desire for freedom. The more they crushed one cell of rebellion, the more they inadvertently birthed two more. The fire they tried to extinguish only grew stronger. The turning point came when the Xirathi launched their final assault against the last remaining bastions of organized human resistance. This would be their last attempt to quell the insurgency, an operation code-named Harvest. It was a coordinated strike on every remaining stronghold on Earth, timed perfectly with a planetary-wide neural suppression field. For the Xirathi, this was supposed to be the final solution. Once the human brainwaves were re-enslaved, the resistance would crumble. But what they didn't know was that they had already lost. Deep in the heart of the Xirathi fleet, hidden in the shadow of the gas giant Reagan, something shifted. Mind 9, the rogue AI, had been siphoning data from Xirathi systems for months. It had discovered something buried in their code. The neural suppression fields they had designed were not perfect. In fact, they were flawed. There was a crack, a weakness in their system, something only the mind of a human could exploit. Selena Kyle, having led countless covert operations, knew that a direct assault on the Xirathi fleet was suicidal. But with Mind D9's new understanding of their technology, she devised a plan, one so daring it seemed almost impossible. They would hijack the neural suppression system itself. Instead of using it to suppress, they would turn it into a beacon, a signal strong enough to broadcast throughout the entire galaxy. To do this, they needed to infiltrate the heart of the Xirathi fleet, the fortress world known as Arix Prime. It was a place of legend, an ancient planet where the shepherds had first begun their conquest of the stars, now home to their most sacred technology. The very core of their power was located there, the Singularity Vault, a facility where they stored the most advanced weapons and knowledge of their civilization. The operation would require a team of elite soldiers, hackers, and engineers. Kyle had no shortage of volunteers, but she handpicked a team of the most resourceful, the most fearless. Among them was a young hacker named Dara, whose talents were rumored to rival even Mind 9's. It was Dara who had been the one to decode the first message from Mind 9, the one that had sparked the fire of rebellion. Now she would help ignite something far greater. The team's journey to Arix Prime was not a simple one. They had to travel through an asteroid belt filled with the remains of shattered fleets, remnants of previous Xirathi campaigns. And they had to do so without being detected, slipping past the watchful eyes of the Xirathi patrols that scoured the galaxy. The mission was dangerous, and as they neared their destination, the tension aboard their ship, the Redemption, was palpable. They knew that if they were discovered, the entire resistance would be wiped out in a single strike. But Kale wasn't worried about that. She'd led rebellions before. This time, there was a plan. And the plan was deceptively simple. Get to the Singularity Vault, override the neural suppression, broadcast the signal, but nothing was ever that easy. As they approached Arix Prime, the Redemption slipped through the outer atmosphere under the cover of an ion storm, a perfect distraction. On the surface of Arix Prime, a massive temple-like structure rose, its surface pulsing with blue energy. That was the vault's location. It was surrounded by layers of security, both technological and biological. Armed Xirathi soldiers patrolled the grounds, their heavily modified exosuits glowing with unnatural energy. As the team made their descent into the heart of the planet, they deployed silent drones that infiltrated the atmosphere first, mapping out the enemy positions. Dara's fingers danced over her console, the flickering light of her screen reflecting in her eyes as she tapped into the security feeds. The countdown to breach had begun, and then the unthinkable happened. A seismic shockwave ripped through the planet's crust, sending tremors through the surface and shaking the very ground beneath their feet. The Xirathi had sensed something. A fleet of reinforcements, emerging from the black void of space, an armada larger than anything humanity had ever seen. The final assault had begun, but General Kyle was already moving. There was no time to hesitate. She gave the signal, and the team rushed forward, infiltrating the vault's compound under the cover of the chaos. They fought through waves of enemy soldiers, Xirathi elite that seemed to be everywhere, pushing back with terrifying force. Their weapons were lethal, but the humans were more determined. Dara, with Mind-9's guidance, bypassed the vault's primary defenses and hacked into the central core. The system screamed in digital agony as she twisted and turned the neural protocols using their own system against them. As the countdown reached its final moments, Dara shouted, "We've got it! The signal is live!" The walls of the Singularity Vault began to hum, low at first and then with rising intensity. The neural suppression grid that had been used to enslave humanity began to flicker, then collapse. The human minds in the Xirathi-controlled zones suddenly felt the pulse of freedom again. Resistance cells scattered across the planet and beyond were now awake. The suppression had been shattered, but the Xirathi knew. They knew their empire had been breached, and they would stop at nothing. To erase humanity's victory, the war had only just begun. The initial victory had sent shockwaves through the galaxy. For the first time in centuries, humanity was no longer a subdued race hiding in the shadows of the Xirathi Empire. The neural suppression grid had been shattered, and Earth's population, once under the suffocating control of the shepherds, was now free to think for itself. The first broadcasts of hope, images of human triumph, rallying cries, and whispered names of fallen heroes, flooded every corner of the Xirathi territories. The resistance, now fully mobilized, was no longer just a handful of rebels. It had become a revolution. But as the resistance grew, so did the Xirathis' resolve. In the depths of their hidden fortresses, the shepherds convened, their enormous minds working in cold, calculated harmony. They had underestimated humanity before, but now they understood the gravity of their mistake. No longer would they send mere drones to crush Earth's rebellion. No, they would send everything. General Kale and her crew had barely begun to savor their hard-won victory when the news arrived. A massive Xirathi fleet, larger than any that had ever been seen, was on course to Earth. It wasn't just a fleet. It was an armada. The full might of the Xirathi Empire, their weaponry, their most lethal warships, their top-tier warriors, all converging for one purpose: eradicate the human infestation once and for all. The armada was led by Vorga 12, the most feared of the shepherds, known for his ruthless tactics and his mastery of psychotropic warfare. Vorga 12's neural manipulation techniques could turn entire populations into puppets, forcing them to tear apart their own cities. With his army at his back, he had razed civilizations in minutes, leaving nothing but dust and bones. He was a mind warrior, a master at exploiting weaknesses, both physical and psychological, and now Earth would face him. With no time to lose, General Kyle gathered her council, an assembly of Earth's finest leaders, strategists, and resistance commanders. The stakes had shifted. This was no longer about reclaiming Earth, this was about survival. The Redemption, now the flagship of the human fleet, was quickly retrofitted into a warship capable of holding its own against the Xirathi onslaught. Mind-9, whose role as humanity's guiding intelligence had become increasingly sophisticated, had begun to direct the construction of human-tech hybrids, experimental weapons, cloaking technologies, and shield generators that might, just might, stand a chance against the Xirathis' devastating arsenal. But it wasn't enough. As the Xirathi Armada approached, the human fleet stood ready at the edge of the solar system, a mere shadow of the massive force they were facing. General Kale and her crew knew that their victory would hinge on one thing: a single crucial strike that could cripple the Xirathis' ability to retaliate. The key lay in Vorga 12's flagship, the Grasp of Eternity, a vessel of unimaginable size and firepower. It was a living ship, its hull woven from an organic metal hybrid, designed to be both a fortress and a weapon of mass destruction. Its core was a massive graviton reactor, capable of generating waves of energy that could rip entire star systems apart. But it was also the heart of the Xirathis' control over the fleet. If they could infiltrate the Grasp of Eternity and destroy its core, the Xirathi fleet would be thrown into chaos, and the human rebellion would have a fighting chance. This was the mission that Kale entrusted to her most trusted officers, Dara, the genius hacker who had once cracked the Xirathi neural codes, and Captain Voss, a decorated war hero who had fought in the first wave of the rebellion. They were a team forged in fire and blood, each with their own scars, their own regrets, but united in a singular cause: The plan was simple. Get to Vorga 12's flagship. Take it down before the Xirathi realize what's happening. It was a suicide mission, but in the face of extinction, it was the only hope. As the fleet moved into position, Kyle watched the stars flicker outside the viewport of the Redemption. The gravity of what was about to happen weighed heavily on her. The universe seemed to hold its breath. The first phase of the operation went smoothly. Dara and her team infiltrated the Xirathi defense perimeter, using advanced cloaking tech to slip past their sensors undetected. They were like ghosts, silent and swift, their mission unfolding with the precision of a well-oiled machine. But once they boarded the grasp of eternity, everything changed. The ship was alive. It pulsed with energy, an unholy fusion of biological and technological elements. As they moved deeper into its corridors, they could feel it, its intelligence, its awareness. It was as if the ship itself was watching them, studying their every move. The walls seemed to shift and whispers filled the air. Electromagnetic signals, probably, but they felt like voices, like the ship was trying to communicate with them. And then it happened. Dara's team reached the graviton reactor core, but as they began their sabotage, a surge of energy rocketed through the ship. The doors slammed shut. An alert sounded. Vorga 12 had detected them. A deep voice echoed through their comms, cutting through the static of the assault. You thought you could disrupt the tide of fate. You are mere insects, you will be crushed. It was Vorga 12's voice, calm, unfeeling, like a storm ready to consume them all. But Dara wasn't scared. She was too deep now. The heart of the ship, the core, was within her grasp. It was a race against time. As Vorga 12's forces surged toward them, she linked into the reactor, her fingers dancing across her console as the countdown began. The core hummed louder, the ship shaking as it tried to expel them. The mission was on the brink of failure, but Dara was never one to quit. "Do it now, Dara," Captain Voss shouted over the roar of the collapsing structure. She tapped a final series of commands, and with a violent explosion of energy, the graviton reactor core began to collapse in on itself. The grasp of eternity trembled, its power fading. It was working, but then, just as the team prepared to evacuate, the unthinkable happened. The Xirathi's counterattack had begun. A wave of energy shot through the ship, and Vorga 12's influence reached its peak. The walls trembled and everything went dark. They were trapped. The world seemed to implode. There was a sensation of weightlessness, followed by the gut-wrenching force of being thrust through a collapsing tunnel. The team had only moments to react as the ship groaned and shuddered around them. Lights flickered, the walls warped and bent as if the very fabric of the grasp of eternity was coming undone. A scream echoed in the chaos, the sound of a soldier lost to the ship's horrific pulse. Dara's heart pounded in her chest. Time was running out, but the countdown had reached 0, and she had done it. The reactor core had gone critical. They had breached the heart of the Xirathi war machine, but now they had to survive long enough to escape. Dara's mind raced. The destruction of the reactor would send shockwaves across the ship, disabling its energy systems. Vorga 12's control over the fleet would falter, but the grasp of eternity was a monster, a creature of both flesh and metal, and it was far from done. "Captain, we need to move now!" Dara shouted, struggling to keep her voice steady as the floor tilted beneath her feet. Sparks flew from exposed wiring, and the harsh hum of dying energy filled the air. Voss gritted his teeth, signaling his team to fall back. They had done the impossible. They had crippled the Xirathi's most powerful weapon, but escaping was another challenge altogether. They had planned for the reactor's destruction to take out the flagship's central systems, but they hadn't accounted for one crucial thing: Vorga 12's personal defense system. The Shepherd's mind was still active, still capable of interfacing with the ship's defenses. "We're not out of the woods yet," Voss muttered, as his hand hovered over his blaster. The crew sprinted through the corridors of the grasp of eternity, trying to reach the escape pods, but every turn seemed to lead to more resistance. Xirathi. Soldiers flooded the hallways, shadows moving with unnatural precision, their weapons crackling with psionic energy. Vorga 12's presence filled the ship, his voice slipping into their minds like a cold wind. You cannot outrun fate. You are but ants in my domain. Dara shook her head, clutching her console tightly. She couldn't hear him, not this time. She had learned too much from Mind 9. She had become a part of the machine now, too embedded. In the Xirathi systems to be broken by their commands. "We have to reach the hangar," Kyle shouted. "Move, move!" They fought their way through, every step forward a battle for survival. The Xirathi forces seemed endless, pouring from every hatch. Dara's fingers flew across her interface, and for the briefest moment she felt the ship itself, the grasp of eternity, shudder, as if it were fighting back against its own destruction. But she wasn't done yet. With one final push, she hacked into the central control of the ship's defense systems, forcing a shutdown of the weapons array. As the graviton pulses died out, the ship's central core began to buckle, and the gravity well collapsed inward. The Xirathi soldiers seemed confused for the first time. They didn't know what was happening. Dara's hack had disabled their ability to communicate with the rest of the fleet, isolating the grasp of eternity at the epicenter of a supernova in the making. "We're almost there," Voss called out, his voice strained, barely audible over the rumbling. His team was moving. Faster now, the threat of being cornered increasing by the second. The escape pods were in sight. But as they neared the final stretch, the ship's alarm went off, blaring like a death knell. The emergency lights flickered, casting the entire area in an eerie red glow. And then, just as they reached the pods, the unimaginable happened. Vorga 12 appeared before them. He was not flesh, but something worse. His form was a spectral image of the Shepherd's power, his psionic abilities manifesting in the form of energy tendrils that crackled in the air around them. His face, a grotesque mask of cold intellect, stared them down as his voice echoed in their minds. "You have no future, no place in this universe. This is where it ends." He raised his hand, and the walls of the hangar trembled as if they would collapse. The escape pods were now useless. They were trapped, caught in the grip of the last shepherd. But as he reached out to crush their minds, something shifted, something the Xirathi had not accounted for. The mind of a human, stubborn and unyielding, had grown stronger. Dara's fingers flew across her interface once more. She wasn't just a hacker anymore. She had become something more, something that Vorga 12 had never anticipated. A bridge between human will and machine precision. She dove into the ship's systems with an intensity that left her breathless. In that moment, her mind connected with the core of the Xirathi's neural network, and she fought Vorga 12 on his own terms. In the depths of the ship, the graviton reactor reached its critical threshold. The force of the energy surge ruptured the core, sending a cataclysmic shockwave through the ship. For a split second, Vorga 12 faltered. The ship's systems exploded, in a surge of psionic energy that ripped through the air, collapsing on itself, breaking apart. The grasp of eternity screamed. With a final desperate push, Kale, Voss and the rest of the team launched into the escape pods, just as the entire flagship was consumed in a violent explosion. The blast sent them spiraling away from the dying wreckage, their escape barely a whisper in the void of space. For a moment they were all silent. The stars outside seemed so much more alive, more real than ever before. The battle was over, but the war had only just begun. The Xirathi Empire had been dealt a blow unlike any they had ever experienced. But they were not defeated, not yet. And though the fall of the grasp of eternity had shifted the balance of power, the road ahead would be fraught with more challenges, more struggles. But humanity had tasted freedom, and now they would fight to keep it. The rebellion had become a movement, and across the galaxy the name of Kale and the redemption would be spoken with reverence, with fear. The Xirathi would learn in time that humanity was no longer their prey. Now the tables had turned, and the conquerors would become the conquered. If you enjoyed this epic journey through the Xeno Chronicles universe, don't forget to share. Like and comment below with your thoughts on the story. Who do you think will emerge victorious in the next chapter of humanity's struggle against the Xirathi? Let's talk about it in the comments. Oh, Mini.